Thank you very much for having me. Like she said, I'm with the American Farm Bureau Federation. I'm one of the economists on staff, and primarily I handle livestock and animal protein and dairy markets. So they asked me to just give you a little bit of a flavor for how things are playing out in the livestock markets. It's certainly been an incredibly interesting last few months here. Moving forward, there's still, I think the big theme here is uncertainty, and most of that revolves around this next slide right here, which is where exactly are we on this COVID-19 curve? What does it mean for states and communities opening back up? And how fast is that going to happen? And, ultimately, even if it does happen, what does that mean for consumers? Because just because a business opens doesn't mean consumers are going to feel safe going out there and participating in these group functions such as restaurants, which ultimately that's been the biggest shock to the demand for most of our agricultural products that we're talking about here. So this is the big 500-pound gorilla in the room that nobody really seems to fully understand or be able to come up with a really good forecast on when we're going to be coming out of this. But that's going to be the biggest player, and honestly makes a lot of what I say and what anybody else is saying likely very wrong, because we really don't know exactly how that's going to play out. So it's a lot of uncertainty, and that's what's been driving some of the volatility, and that we'll go over what you've seen in the cash and futures markets for cattle and hogs here in a little bit. But that's really what's driving a lot of that, is just a lot of uncertainty about where we're going to be within a few months, or even out of this by the end of the year. I think I see a raised hand from someone. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. I don't know how you guys wanted to handle that, Whitney. If no one's...
However you're comfortable, take while you're present or at the end.
That works for me, but considering that no one spoke up with their question, it could just be an accidental hand raise, which sometimes happens on these things as well. So if you do have a question and you raise your hand, just unmute yourself and ask me the question. Very happy to do it as we're moving through. But my big caveat there is I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to be able to speak with any authority whatsoever on how fast we're going to be coming out of this in terms of health issues, the public health perspective. One thing before moving further into the livestock markets is it helps to kind of frame what happened these last 2 months and the massive shocks that we saw to the system, is to get a better understanding of how Americans spend their money on food. Many people may not fully realize that as a whole, Americans spent 54% of their food expenditure dollars away from home, meaning that they didn't make dinner at home. That was being spent at restaurants, food service, cruise lines, industrial, hotel, quick service, full service. All of that is kind of accompanied or lumped into these other categories. So food away from home is how Americans were spending their food dollars. And when you shut down that segment of the economy, of course, it's going to cause a massive adjustment in the system. It was a huge exogenous shock. And really on the meat side of things, we kind of think of this in two separate events. The one is kind of at the beginning of this COVID-19 situation where you saw the early panic buying. That was a demand-driven issue. Not even necessarily a full demand so much as consumers were panic buying, they were stocking up their freezers, and that was the initial shutdown of the restaurants. And then more recently, within the last 3, 4, 5 weeks or so, you saw a different shock to the system, which was more on the supply side, which was those labor issues at the packers and the processing facilities. To go a little bit further into that, we can see exactly what that drop in food service restaurants were. So you saw, again, before COVID-19, the majority of food dollars were being spent, that blue line, hovering between 60 and 65 billion for early 2020. And then most recent data that we have for April dropped by about half down to the 33 billion range. While in-person dining in restaurants was closed down. I know some states have started a slow reopening at reduced capacity. You still had fast food, takeaway, that kind of stuff operating, but that was not enough to make up for the lost in-person dining. Like we said, it dropped by over half. You saw that initial spike, additionally, in grocery store retail level purchases. A lot of that now this is everything, but a lot of that was in the meat case, which is where we saw consumers sharing some of those pictures of empty meat cases on social media, fueling some of that early panic buying. Since that initial spike in March, we have come back down a little bit. Again, once a freezer is full, consumers are going to have to start working their way through that freezer. So you did see the system catch up pretty quickly there. When we look, particularly when we're talking later on about policy fixes, trying to figure out what the impact has been to various sectors of the agricultural economy and what the potential payments for the policy side, as well as just estimated how badly certain segments of the economy were hurt. One area we can look at is the futures prices. It kind of gives us a more centralized location. I know it doesn't capture the localized experience that people are having, but when it comes to calculating some of these payments, USDA might be leaning to more of a central nationalized price. Rice actually doing all right, up 20% since the beginning of the year. But some of the ones that are hurt, at least early on, hogs was taken on a roller coaster. Class 4 milk, Class 3 originally was a pretty big drop, but it's had some recovery here in the recent weeks. Fed and feeder cattle also had a pretty rough go of it early on, but again, some recovery in the last month or so. But you've seen pretty much every sector of the agricultural economy has had its share of price declines as a result of COVID-19. That's, again, just a huge exogenous shock to the system. But I am here to talk primarily about livestock, and I know you folks are interested in the cattle markets as well. We're talking about cash markets. We tend to use, because mainly it's data availability, but the 5-area average, best thing you're going to get to more of a national price for fed cattle. When this first started, you saw that initial decline out of a lot of concern for packing capacity. Packers were bidding a little bit less in the cash market, and then you saw the panic buying happen, which is that spike about mid-March that you see on that blue line on the left graph for 2020. Since that initial panic buying, we've seen a dramatic decline in the price of fed cattle. A lot of that is the packing capacity availability, essentially, as a result of those labor issues that, it's been well publicized, those packing plants that are having to shut down. Even if they're not shutting down, they're running at reduced capacity. It's gotten a lot better the last few weeks, but 2-3 weeks ago, you're hearing a lot of stories of some plants down to 40, as much as 50% capacity, 60% capacity. When that happens, you basically have an immediate oversupply of fed cattle on the market, and they weren't bidding or participating very much in the cash market. A lot of what the shackle space that they needed filled was already filled by some of those other purchasing agreements that were locked into place. You saw a relatively similar story, maybe not quite as dramatic in the feeder side. So we have Oklahoma City here is a pretty complete price series that sometimes we use. Again, not going to be your exact localized experience, but you saw early to mid-March that initial drop, quick rebound, and then kind of going sideways for the most part since there. Still has not recovered to where we were at the beginning of the year. Looking at the futures on the cattle side of things, even more volatile than the cash markets. Again, March being where a lot of the big swings took place. People were really, let's just say, panic wasn't part of it, but there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. Again, you think back to March, whenever, mid-March to late March is when a lot of the states started putting into place those stay-at-home orders. And I think if we could get someone to mute, that would be helpful. We're starting to get a little bit of feedback, but putting in those stay-at-place orders, part of when you think about these futures prices, especially the deferred months, they're getting a little bit better on both feeder and fed. The further out you get month-wise, but even with that in place, futures prices are just that, an expectation of prices in the future. And one thing most people are saying is going to happen later on this year is that the U.S. is going to be in a full-fledged economic recession, very likely. Most economists are predicting that we're not going to have that V-shaped recovery. It's going to be much slower climb out of this. And whenever you have a recession, one of the animal proteins that just does not fare as well as the others is beef. It's a luxury product, it costs more, it's better quality, but it does cost more, especially relative to the other animal proteins. And as a result, whenever consumers have less money in their pockets, either because of job loss or just hours cut, wages reduced, they're going to be looking for ways to make that dollar stretch a little bit further. And beef tends to suffer a little bit more than the other animal proteins at the meat case during a recession. So that's definitely coming into play there whenever you talk about where people are expecting futures prices to be for some of these animals. Some of that is expectations of where beef demand could be later on in the year. Again, some of it is just plain flat uncertainty in the market, driving a lot of that as well. This is one that, a lot of producers across the country have taken notice. The president took notice as well. He, after several state attorneys general signed on to a letter encouraging him to have the DOJ investigate the pricing activity going on at the packing level. He pretty much directly referenced wholesale prices skyrocketing like they did while the prices for animals were going down in the way that they did. I think he just said, that's not supposed to happen that way. Even before the DOJ investigation, which is a completely different investigation than what was already occurring over at USDA, was the Packers and Stockyards Division had already been conducting their own investigation into any potential impropriety on behalf of the on behalf of the Packers. What they were looking at, basically they took the investigation that was already occurring since last year that they were looking into, if you remember the packing plant fire in Holcomb, Kansas at that Tyson facility. USDA had already opened an investigation into that situation. And so basically they looked at this COVID-19 situation and said, we're going to roll that into the pre-existing investigation. So AFBF was supportive of that. Again, not pointing any figures, not saying anything necessarily wrong has happened, but in these situations, it may create a perverse incentive for someone to take advantage of the situation. And that's what USDA was looking into, is to make sure that that didn't happen. We saw, again, looking at that left graph, the choice box beef cutout, which is wholesale prices for beef. I do have some caveats on what this graph is actually showing, but just to give people a little bit of flavor, if you look around August on that red line, which was 2019, a little bit further on the right-hand side of that graph, you see that initial little spike. I don't know if my mouse is visible, but around right there, that was the Holcomb, Kansas fire. And if you remember, whenever that happened, the sky might as well have been falling, at least in cattle markets from what we were hearing from everybody. And then earlier this year, the original March panic buying happened. And then this is just absolutely unprecedented. Choice box beef cutout more than doubled just in a matter of a month. That's just, again, been absolutely crazy. However, the big caveat is grocery stores do not buy all of the meat that they sell on a week-to-week basis, which means that when the Packers were selling beef at these prices, not all the beef that they were delivering to the grocery stores were being sold at those prices. A lot of the grocery stores will have meat bought, 4, 6, 8 weeks out ahead of time. And what was really driving that spike is there was a limited amount of beef basically up on the free and open market that was not spoken for. And when you have a lot of retailers with panic buying going on, trying to refill their meat case, and they're only going after a small pot of available meat, that's what drove those spikes up so quickly. And it was, again, just a humongous spike in the box beef cutouts. And that is what, again, caught a lot of our producers' attention. I just showed you those graphs of the price of cattle going down and the price of wholesale beef going up. It frustrated a lot of folks. Looking at what drove some of those spikes, This kind of ties back to why I showed you how Americans spend their food. Is if you look back around March, you can definitely see what was driving that was purely demand-driven, consumer-driven. People were going to the grocery store and filling up their freezers, and when they do that, they pick the economical cuts. They're trying to get a lot of ground beef, more economical roast, chicken thighs. They're not buying fillets, ribeyes necessarily, tenderloins. And you can see that reflected in what happened with the different value of the beef primals is your chuck and round shot up. By early April, the round was actually more expensive than the loin. If you look at the value it contributes to the cutout, because there's a lot more meat on the chuck and round than it is on necessarily the rib or loin sometimes. You actually saw the chuck and round were contributing a lot more to the value of the overall cutout than any other cut was. And that was, again, those consumers going and panic buying at the retail level. There was a point back in late March where one of the most expensive cuts, typically your tenderloin, dropped to like significantly almost nothing compared to what it usually is. Part of that reason is it was highly exposed to the restaurant food service sector. When steakhouses are closed, not many people are out there eating those fine dining steak experiences. I personally love grilling every chance that I can get, but the average American isn't going to be grilling beef as much as they would have eaten steaks if they were going out to eat. So the retail spike did not make up for the loss in food sector. I got to emphasize that because I know a lot of folks were frustrated seeing maybe empty milk cases, empty meat cases. That was a short-term supply chain hiccup, and unfortunately, it did not overcompensate for the loss of the food service. Some consumers, the general consumers, don't really fully understand that. So at AFBF, and I'm sure at Virginia Farm Bureau, you got folks, part of what our comms folks are doing is trying to communicate to the consumer that, you know, the farmer is not, this is not a windfall for the farmer. The farmer is facing declining prices, and making sure the consumer understands this concept that just because its prices are going up at retail level doesn't mean that's trickling down to the farmer, because that's just not what's happening. This is also an inevitable result of that. This graph also comes with quite a few caveats, this live to cutout spread. The reason I use live to cutout spread instead of margins is because this isn't their actual margins. The only person who knows what the packer margins are the packer. People can do their best to try and estimate it from the outside, but unless they just share their financials with us, we're not going to be able to see it. So this is just very simply the difference between the prices of wholesale and byproduct values on a per 1,000 pounds of steer basis minus how much it costs to buy that. So when I talk about that, that's the idea is being this is not including things like labor, it's not including overhead, it's not including any of that fixed cost of running a plant. So it's a little misleading just to look at this. Now, granted, we use this as just an overall relative health of the packers. And, you know, on a per animal basis, they are making more in just that side of things. This is definitely not accounting for the increased spending that you're seeing on PPE for workers. It's not accounting for the increased costs to the packer running at reduced speeds. I mentioned those plants running at 60, 70%, 50% capacity. Part of the way these packers stay profitable is by spreading fixed costs over a lot of animals. And if they're running at a lower throughput of the plant, then you're going to see less animals to spread that fixed cost out over. So this is a little bit misleading, but you know, at the end of the day, packer margins were pretty healthy, particularly back in March, even if they aren't as much now. Can't leave out hogs. They've been experiencing their own roller coaster throughout all of this as well. Hog futures, kind of similar story to cattle futures. That initial drop, a bit of recovery throughout the month of April. The CME lean hog index, also similar, that initial drop with the recovery throughout the month of April. Sorry if I'm speeding up. I want to try and, I know I have 30 minutes and I want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. Pork cutout, similar to beef cutout, but a little bit different in that with pork, you weren't looking at unprecedented levels of the cutout. Pork, at least I don't know how fresh it is on everybody's minds, but back in 2014, we had a serious disease that just decimated much of the pork industry. So we've seen, at least in the last 5-6 years, the level of the pork cutout that we've seen, because that was purely a supply-driven thing. You just didn't have enough product on the market as a result of losing so much of your herd due to the virus. So, but you did not see it increase to the magnitude and the speed with which it increased this time. So that's something to point out as well. Again, looking at the different primals of the pork cutout, you saw different primals contributing at different times. Pork bellies were on a crazy roller coaster. You can see the kind of blue dotted line that jumps all over the place. Prior to the beginning of COVID, it had been just a fantastic story of adding value to the cutout. And then early on in COVID, the price declined dramatically. Part of what was driving that is pork, like the tenderloin, is very exposed to the food service restaurant sector. Here in America, we eat a lot of bacon cheeseburgers. We also love our Denny's triple grand slam breakfast with extra bacon. And that was initially taking a pretty big hit at the start of it. So again, going back to how the consumer spends their food and the fact that it's not a simple switch that you can flip to shift all of that food from the food service and restaurant sector over into retail. There's a lot of challenges for the system. Now, I think our system adapted fairly quickly, at least early in March. It had a lot more struggle with the labor issue. That was a much bigger hit than just consumers panic buying like we saw happen in March. I think I've already talked a little bit about this, but the big uncertainty question, I think, in terms, or if I'm going to break it down into the driver of this uncertainty, of course, is COVID, but that pushes on to two things from a supply and a demand standpoint. From the supply side, the COVID uncertainty is driving the slaughter plant uncertainty. We don't know how long these plants are going to take to get back to full capacity. They're doing a lot better than they were 3 to 4 weeks ago. There's still some room to go. We'll show slaughter numbers here in a little bit, but it was kind of a moving target to estimate how much pork or beef capacity was down at a given time, because every day, there was a week there where, every day there could have been a new plant closing down or an old plant that was closed opening back up. And there's no way to fully estimate, at least at this time, how many plants were running at reduced capacity. You knew how many plants were down because they'd have a news announcement and you knew the estimated capacity of that individual plant and you're able to add it to the total. But there's no way to really estimate what was happening in terms of all these plants running at that reduced capacity. So the best proxy we have for that is slaughter numbers and what happened with that. One thing, again, I'll touch on is I think the bigger potential than full plants going down for 2 weeks at a time to impact the market is that reduced capacity. It takes, 5 of our largest plants running at 70% capacity is going to make a much bigger difference than one of those plants going down for 2 weeks. I think that's something to keep in mind, is making sure that we can fix that labor issue at the plant to keep those workers safe to where they are willing to and feel comfortable going back to work. Weekly cattle slaughter. Now, I mentioned our best proxy for overall capacity is, all right, how many animals were actually slaughtered or moving through the system. We have been running ahead of the last 3 years in terms of a slaughter schedule. That changed dramatically towards the end of March. We saw that just crater in cattle slaughter. From its high to its low, cattle slaughter dropped about 38–40%. The last 2 weeks, we have looked at increasing numbers. So fingers crossed, knock on wood, the packing plants do seem to be gearing back up and staying open. I don't know if they fully figured out how to manage COVID occurring within the plants, but that's some much needed relief for our producers. This is something that has the potential to be a huge, it already is sending shockwaves to the industry. If that had stayed down for any longer or hadn't started recovering, that would just be astronomical to our industry in terms of what to do with those animals. Cattle, and I know individual experiences are going to differ on this, but cattle may have a little bit more wiggle room, and I use that as an aggregate, as an industry has a little bit more wiggle room than say pork, which is even more of a just-in-time delivery system. Whenever the hogs are ready to move on to the next stage of production, there's no waiting, there's no keeping them on pasture. They're not ruminants. You got to do your best to slow the rate of growth, which a lot of producers are moving into maintenance rations, increasing barn temperatures, airflow, trying to make them uncomfortable to where their rate of gain slowed down substantially. Yet producers doing everything they can to slow the weight gain and the flow of animals through the system. But at the end of the day, we had to see some depopulation and euthanization in the hog markets. But on the plus side, the hog market, in terms of slaughter, has seen more of a rebound than, say, beef has. We're back up over 2.1 million head a week. From its high back in late March down to its low in early May, we saw almost a 50%. We saw 45% decline in hog slaughter. And that's what drove a lot of those headlines. I believe you saw it recently in New York Times, you had it in Wall Street Journal, across the country. Mainstream media is picking up on the fact that producers are having to cull some of these animals. And a lot of that is, again, driven by the labor issue that you're seeing in the packing plants as a result of COVID. But with that, Whitney, I don't know how much time we have, but I can talk a little bit about some of the recent CARES packages as well. Just a quick brush over in terms of what ag received. About 9.5 billion in the CARES package went to the Office of the Secretary, which was then basically wrapped up with some additional funding from the CCC authority that they already had left over. This CCC replenishment of 14 billion, you're not going to see a little bit until later in the summer. But combining that 9.5 with some leftover that you saw in CCC, we got the CFAP program direct payments. So 16 billion is going to be going in direct payments to agriculture. Now, they just on Friday, OMB cleared the rule, and my understanding is tomorrow we should be getting more details on what those payments are actually going to look like and what the process for going ahead and getting it is going to look like. At this point, I know it's been frustrating. USDA has been trying to move as fast as they can, but you know, the rules at OMB, it's going to take them a little while to clear it. But we have not had any real details on what the payments are going to look like. And honestly, this breakdown and what sector is going to get what still hasn't been officially reported by USDA. It was leaked information from a senator on the Hill who got an embargoed copy and put it out there without first clearing that they shouldn't have been doing that. But so these numbers are subject to change. We do know 16 billion. One thing that Undersecretary Northey has indicated on one of his calls with several of the State Farm Bureau presidents is that, you know, that 5.1 for cattle, 2.9 for dairy, those are, you know, estimates, targeted budgets. It's not like once you hit 5.1, they're going to stop making payments to cattle. There's wiggle room to shift around between these industries. So if 5.1 in cattle actually needed 6, they'll move it from somewhere else that didn't need the full amount that they got. So just to put a little bit of that perspective. With that, Whitney, I think I'm around the 30-minute time mark. Happy to take any questions or hear any thoughts or feedback from the members.
Well, thank you, Michael. You're welcome to stay online here if you've got time in case folks have questions, but also want to be respectful of your time, and thank you for your presentation. Very helpful, lots of information, and so we appreciate you giving us a moment of your time.
Thank you very much for having me. And, you know, if anybody has any questions that they didn't want to ask in front of the whole group, or you disagree with me on any of that, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk to members and do everything we can to try and get your questions answered.
Into our next speaker, which is going to be Mike Carpenter with VDAX, who's the manager of Livestock Services. He is going to give us a presentation about what's happening here a little bit more locally across the Commonwealth, and a colleague of his, Willie Morris, will be joining him. So at this time, Mike, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Okay, I'll give just a few opening comments, and then Willie will cover some up-to-date price information for us regarding feeder cattle. First of all, we saw very minimal disruptions in our marketplaces here in Virginia. Winchester, Farmers Livestock in Winchester was closed for 2 weeks in April. And when they reopened, they've now made the decision that they will be grading feeder cattle every week. Prior to that, they had had 1 and sometimes 2 graded sales a month. And when they reopened, they determined that there were a number of people who didn't really know when they might sell their cattle. So they decided to continue to have graded feeder cattle sales every week at Winchester. And they really like that change because it's a lot less sale time for them. The buyers seem to really like it. There's less time at the market as far as they're concerned. So all around, it sounds like a win-win situation. The only other market that closed was Abingdon for 1 week, and that was Easter weekend. But other than that, we've not had any markets close in Virginia. Just follow up on some of the comments gentlemen from American Farm Bureau made. One thing that was brought to light last week, we've seen unprecedented decline in beef slaughter, and one point was brought out last week that we have seen increased beef imports, which has made up some of the difference for our reduced slaughter. And for example, the example given was that imports from Mexico are up 12% over the last month. And I have seen some of their product in stores here in Virginia, Mexican products. So we get some of the higher cuts. They take some of the offal and some of our lower quality parts of the carcass. So it's a swap. And it's interesting that the U.S., as far as Mexico is concerned, the U.S. is their #1 destination for their beef exports. So just an interesting side note there. As far as the national market a little bit, some people are predicting higher prices ahead. I heard the comment about, when we come out of a recession, that sometimes beef is the last to pick that up. I think the question that I'm beginning to ponder is, we've seen prices, gyrate and yo-yo during this time period. And my concern is what will happen if and when we get slaughter back to, quote, normal or even above where they were, trying to catch up on some of the backlog in the production pipeline. So what will happen to prices? Will consumers continue some of that pent-up demand to purchase beef products? I think that's going to be a big question that nobody can answer now, but it's something in my mind looming in the background that might affect our market. I've also been following the hog market, even though we don't have much commercial production of hogs here in Virginia, but nationally, live hog prices in the Midwest got down to 24 cents a pound. That's probably equivalent to the 8 cent a pound crash we saw in the 1990s. They have rebounded a little bit now. They're up to 30 cents, but still just not a very good situation for the hog producers. That's all of the general comments I have. I'm going to turn it over to Willie now, and he's going to cover feeder cattle markets.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So with the feeder cattle market in Virginia, looking at what we've got that we're dealing with right now, for the week of May the 1st, we saw 4,167 head that were state graded. And obviously that is not all the cattle that were traded in the state of Virginia, but that's what we have to report on. And then last week, the week of May the 8th, we saw just right around 3,900 head. In the first week of May, we saw a severe, probably not a severe, but a pretty sharp drop in the pricing of our feeder cattle, mainly due to the fact that in Virginia this time of year, what we're looking at is folks that are putting these cattle in to be grazed, and people are buying grazing cattle. So the lighter cattle, once we saw that demand drop, we saw the price drop. The heavier cattle, and when I say heavier cattle, the fleshier 7 to 9 weight cattle, I mean they've been soft in demand as far as the market is concerned. So we saw that those, that they've been soft all the way through this issue that we're going through with COVID-19. But as of last week, we kind of saw the 5 weight, 6 weight cattle, they kind of flattened out a little bit. We saw an average price last week of the 5 to 6 weight steers at $1.40, realizing that there's specific issues going on, that when people determine the demand for cattle, they can get quite a bit higher. And we saw that last week at Rockingham Livestock, where there were some cattle there that had a demand for them that spiked the market a little bit and probably propped it up just a notch and made it look pretty level. But right now what we're seeing is mostly the heavier cattle, the 8, 9 weights that we typically send to places like Pennsylvania to be fed. I mean, they're in that $1.08 to $1.10 range at best, and then occasionally we see some special demand cattle, some cattle that people are looking for, that they want. They might get a little bit higher, but we see a lot of peaks and valleys, I guess is the best way to put it, in our market right now, where things look really, really good or they look really, really bad. And I think it's just kind of unfortunately the sign of the times, and what we've listened to is pretty accurate in terms of the backlog of these heavy cattle is causing some of that issue in how these cattle are being traded throughout the state. I mean, we see more, and I'm looking at the reports right now. I mean, it's a discrepancy on the 5 to 6 weight cattle all the way, in our medium and large number 1 calves. We're seeing discrepancies of over 30 cents, and that's probably not. Yeah, it's not normal for any other time, but that's kind of where we're at when certain cattle come up for sale that people want and people want to bid on. We're going to get that, and I think that over the next 3, 4, 5 months we're going to continue to see that. Visiting with some of the folks that we sell cattle to, Pennsylvania up into Canada, I mean the theory and the thought process is if we can get our slaughter facilities open and running at full capacity, it could be up into November, December before we see this thing level out and be more what used to be normal. So we're going to see highs and we're going to see lows throughout this process that we've probably not seen for a while, unfortunately. So that's kind of where we're at with the market reports on cattle that are graded in the state of Virginia, and the numbers seem to be relatively normal in terms of our feeder cattle, but if we continue to get backlogged on the slaughter end of it, it's going to make for some interesting discrepancies on what they bring in terms of who wants them and when they are sold. I guess I've visited with a gentleman that has bought a lot of Virginia feeder cattle that is in Canada, and his impression on the market is this thing's gonna last a while like that. So we're gonna have to kind of deal with it until hopefully the demand will continue to support the supply that we're going to have, because we're going to have a large amount of supply up into next year sometime to get all these things run through the system. But that's pretty much what I have. If anybody has any questions, they can ask.
Hey, Willie, it's Margaret Ann.
Yes, ma'am.
I guess it's more for Mike. Mike talked about the import of beef. Did I miss it? But did you guys talk about the export? And if I read right, didn't we export a tremendous amount of beef last month and the first quarter more than, like, we were up like 9 or 10% over the year before?
Yes,
is that what you guys read as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, we did. And at the same time, there were people suggesting that needed to turn around, that we needed to take care of our domestic need first. And I have not seen an update to see if that actually happened. And the same thing was happening with pork. China quadrupled their pork imports the first 3 months of the year.
So the numbers I saw, that we were up about 40,000 on imports year over year, and on exports we're up almost 70,000. So about almost a wash, really, from year over year, from looking at USDA numbers and kind of reading those. So it's a good thing, right? Maybe it's the value of the cuts and the type of things. I've always been taught that what we export is not what we eat in the U.S. for a big part of it. So
exactly.
What about live animal export? Is it up or down for Virginia?
Live
cattle export.
Are you talking heifer export, or what do you?
Heifer, dairy, any of that? I mean, we send a lot of them out of the state every year, but is that being impacted at all by COVID-19?
That's a good question.
So a month ago, last year was a really good year for the export of breeding animals to foreign countries. It had backed off for a while, and a month ago, I heard that there were some countries with renewed interest. I don't know if that's been followed through on. I would suggest, I don't know. It could have been postponed a little bit, waiting for the situation to die down. But generally, once those people become interested, they'll eventually get the animals, even if it's delayed.
I visited with somebody this morning, actually, that said they had a significant order. It was a matter of getting the right kind and making sure that the financial part of it was in order, but there was a significant order, more breeding heifers.
Mike?
Yes.
So, Jimmy Henshaw, I want to ask a question. How are we getting any cattle from outside of Virginia coming through Virginia being exported? And if so, are we using any of our Virginia cattle funds to do so, to subsidize it?
There are cattle that work their way through Virginia or through a Virginia contact, but to my knowledge, now you say your checkoff funds being utilized to aid that in some way?
I'm asking if you know of any of it happening. I've seen very little effort. We spending, the extra money now on checkoff here in Virginia, and I don't know what's been going on. It seems like we should have been in the game a good while back to try to export Virginia cattle. But if we're bringing cattle in from out of state and then exporting them, are we using any of our Virginia checkoff funds to do so to subsidize that operation?
Okay. Not yet. And I think you're speaking of the new Virginia Cattle Industry Board, and that group has just organized over the last year. And Willie can speak to this more, but they're in the process of accepting the first round of grant applications right now. So Willie, I'll let you follow up on that.
Any cattle that are traded through Virginia are technically legally binded to pay that checkoff money, which is 50 cents a head. So if there would be a case where cattle come in and go through Virginia, yes, they should be paying their 50 cents per head to be utilized for the promotion of Virginia cattle. Other than that, would there be a further? I guess I was a little confused about the question. What were you more concerned about there? They weren't paying, or
my question really was, I was trying to follow up on what Margaret was asking, and I think that sometimes we're losing sight when we subsidize exports. If we go subsidize, in my opinion, that ought to be Virginia cattle from the get-go. And if they're only paying 50 cents a head to get any kind of subsidy out of Virginia, what kind of subsidies are we talking about? Say if you send a plane load or ship them on a boat or whatever, how's that hitting our funds to bring out cattle from outside the state of Virginia through Virginia and use our funds to export them? Usually I think you send employees from the different state departments and things with those cattle. What does it cost? That's something I never see. What it's really costing to subsidize the export of cattle.
Well, my question on that would be, who is doing the exportation, and are they gaining state funds to do it? As of right now, are they gaining state funds to do that or not?
That's my question.
And I don't. There's no state funds. From the Virginia Cattle Industry Board, as of this point, nobody is giving them money to export cattle. So my thought, and this would be just my thought, and not knowing it for a fact, but they're not getting any state money to do what they're doing. It's all private industry.
Okay, you've answered my question. I'll wait a while, a little later in the year, maybe.
I don't know that. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my thought, because I don't know that. Maybe Mike knows more than I do, but I don't think that they're getting state funds to do their exportation.
No, you're right. That's all handled through private companies. There's been no direct state funds, cattle checkoff or otherwise, that aid in in exporting breeding animals. As far as feeder cattle promotions, we promote Virginia feeder cattle, but that's just limited to promotional trips to promote the cattle. No direct payments of any kind to support the sale of those animals.
Okay, thank you.
I got a quick question for you. This is Chris Haskins here, South Virginia. Also, I work for Virginia Farm Bureau as a field director. You all mentioned the first week of May there was around 4,200 head of graded cattle through Virginia. I was wondering, are you comparing these numbers with 2019 numbers? If so, what percentage are we behind as far as marketing these animals on a numbers basis? Because here in Southside, everyone's preaching hold, and that's good in a way. But when I get asked my opinion, I say, true, when we come out of this, there's going to be more of a demand probably, but it's also going to be a higher supply of cattle because you're going to have more numbers of cattle being provided at heavier weights. So it's more meat. So,
yep.
Just wondering if you're keeping up with the number.
Yep. So I took a look at those numbers, and yes, numbers were reduced at Southside more than in other parts of the state as far as numbers marketed, and that's typically that area sells cattle at lighter weights. So if there was a group of producers in general that could hold the cattle to heavier weights, it would be more those Southside producers with fall-born calves that typically try to hit the grass market in the spring. So it's been scattered, yeah. And I look at Lynchburg. Numbers were really down for a while. The last couple of weeks, they have come back up to more what you might consider normal. So we are seeing a bit of a rebound, and other areas, are seeing anywhere from normal to slightly reduced numbers across the state.
Thanks, both Mike and Willie, for that. Appreciate your time today and your insight. And you're welcome to stay on the call, but also want to be respectful of time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony Banks, who many of you know works for Virginia Farm Bureau as a Senior Assistant Director in the Agriculture Development and Innovation Department. He's going to provide us with an update on the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, CFAP, and what we know as of today about direct payment to producers. Michael from AFBF hinted a little bit about that. So, Tony, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Whitney, and I'm going to try to roll through this pretty quickly. Some of you may have already seen a lot of this information that I'm going to share, because right now we're still in a holding pattern, waiting for USDA to make its announcement. But just to summarize what we're looking at in the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, as Michael mentioned earlier, we're looking at $16 billion in direct payments to eligible producers. Another $3 billion was earmarked for food purchases. And within the direct payments, approximately, given some of the early announcements, approximately $9.6 billion is earmarked, or probably earmarked, for livestock. And you saw Michael's breakdown of the slide there, with roughly $5 billion to cattle, $1.6 billion to hogs, and $2.9 to dairy. What we're waiting on now is for USDA to finalize the regulations, and I guess they have. And as Michael mentioned, it's gone before OMB. So we're basically waiting for the announcement at this point, and that may come from either Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue, or it may even come from President Trump himself. But what we have heard so far, and this was early on, was that the direct payments for cattle and other commodities would be if that particular commodity experienced a 5% or greater loss in price over January through mid-April. The expectation is that the payment would equate to 85% of the of that loss in sales that occurred January through April 15th. April 15th, there approximately. And there would be a second component to the payment, or a second payment that would be 30% of the expected losses for the following 2 quarters through September 30. So in the first 3.5, or the first 3.5 months, you actually had to. What we're hearing is you actually have to had a sale and experienced a loss, in order to be eligible for that payment. And whereas the second part of the payment is just an expected loss through September. So if you have animals that that normally wouldn't be sold until later in the year, then the expectation is that they would qualify for some payment. There is a $125,000 payment limitation per commodity, with a $250,000 limit per individual or entity. I think we're still waiting to find out from USDA if that $250,000 limit is going to equate to a $500,000 limit for married couple, for instance. But that's some of the details that we're still waiting to hear. I would say we are getting closer. I can tell you that Farm Service Agency is expected, or they have training planned for this Thursday for state and county office staff. If those folks are getting trained on the program and some of the details, then you can expect an announcement is imminent, or at least that would be my perspective. Another aspect of the direct payments, there is an adjusted gross income limit of $900,000 unless at least 75% of that is derived from agriculture. And there has been some suggestions that USDA may reduce certain payments subject to payments that individuals may have received or from other existing USDA programs, basically to avoid some double dipping. But we'll have to see how that goes. I know the USDA and small business have both said that producers that participated in the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as the Economic Income Disaster Loan and the Loan Advance programs, that those 2 programs will not count against participation in the CFAP direct payment program, and vice versa. Just to touch briefly on the food purchase program, of that $3 billion, a good portion of that money was earmarked for the Farms to Families Food Box program, which was a commodity, or is a commodity purchase program that was, the intent is to remove product from supplies that would have otherwise been earmarked for institutional markets, schools, restaurants, hotels, what have you. Those food products are to be packaged in consumer-ready boxes, and they begin, or have begun, with the purchases. That we'll be looking at $100 million a month for meat, another $100 million a month for fruit and vegetables, and another $100 million a month for dairy and milk. The meat boxes at this point in time are limited to cooked chicken and cooked pork. The chicken growers and turkey growers are not going to be eligible for any payments under CFAP. And since we do have a significant uptick in demand for food assistance, there's a tremendous amount of cooked frozen chicken and pork sitting in storage, and this was this is one way to clear that product and hopefully help lend some support to the protein sector there. Just last week, USDA, last week or week before last, USDA announced another $472 million in spending on Section 32, which is the Emergency Food Assistance Program, where they will be making additional, what I would refer to as a la carte purchases for different surplus items, which again could be certain vegetables and fruits and different meat products, and that's going to vary throughout. I guess just to wrap up, let me pull my page up here. Especially for cattle producers and sheep and hogs, you guys probably have some neighbors that have very little contact with the Farm Service Agency. FSA is going to be administering the direct payments. So we have been encouraging people to reach out to their local FSA office, and at the very least, let that office know that you exist, and so that when the program is announced, the office can contact you back to begin the process. There's, of course, it's USDA. There's going to be several forms, and is some of it's going to be something as basic as contact information and the name of your entity that's applying, and what's your adjusted gross income for program eligibility, and on basic contact information. They're also going to be collecting bank information so they can make direct deposits. So you won't have to wait for it for the mail for the checks. And I guess lastly, producers will have to complete an AD 1026, which is basically a statement of ensuring compliance with highly erodible land conservation and wetlands conservation. And that's sometimes in the past that can be kind of tricky. You complete the paperwork and the payments are made in earnest, and lo and behold, USDA comes back later on and does spot checks, and maybe that person wasn't in compliance, and that could be problematic going forward. So especially for people who do not have a transaction history with Farm Service Agency, they need to spend take the time to ask questions about some of these different things when you're talking with FSA personnel. And most of this can be done over the phone. I know USDA has said they're going to take steps to try and expedite as much of this process as possible. But again, I cannot stress, if you don't have a relationship, you need to be contacting that office now to at least get your name in the system so they can follow up with you. And with that, unless there are any questions, Whitney, I'm done.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Anybody have questions for Tony?
Yes, this is Alan Lee. Tony, on the 85% and the 30% component of this, as I understand what you said and what I've read about this, you get the 85% if you actually sold before April 15. But if you sold on May 1 or you sell in June, you get 30%. Have they explained the rationale for the dramatic difference in the kind of the make whole? Why they are spending, so much more on the early in the year sales as opposed to the later in the year sales. It struck me that was a pretty dramatic difference.
I haven't heard the reasoning or rationale behind that. I would speculate that that with the April 15th, and I believe I was on one call, and the undersecretary, at that point in time said, well, it may be April 15th or April 17th, somewhere in that time frame. At the point in time that the legislation was passed, they knew what they had, or where the market had fallen to. So everything that occurs after the approximate time the legislation was passed, that was speculative and looking forward. Right now, before Congress, they're working on CARES 2.0. So there is an expectation that more money will probably be in the pipeline. Like as I mentioned, there were some segments that did not receive any funding for direct payments or any type of direct relief, that have also taken pretty significant hits. So it is possible that with CARES 2.0, that there may be additional money for sales that occur after April 15th. And I guess last week the House, in their $3 trillion CARES 2.0 bill, in that House vote, that would have added another $16 billion for direct payments to farms. But as it's been widely reported, the Senate has said that bill, the House bill, is not going anywhere, and so we'll have to see how that negotiates out. But we, I would anticipate there's going to be additional monies, and some of that may go back to commodities that have already been approved for funding, and I do expect to see that commodities that weren't addressed in the previous in the current package will be addressed in to some degree in a secondary package. That's a long-winded answer to say I don't know. All right, well, Whitney, I'll turn the meeting back over to you or Mrs. Edmondson.